In this third part of our videos for this week, I want to continue to talk with you about other kinds of intertextuality. Let's talk first about allusion. Allusion takes place when one writer makes an indirect connection or an indirect reference to another writer. Something that alerts the mind of the reader to the connection between two texts without citing or quoting the earlier text. In Matthew, allusions, along with quotations and citations from the Old Testament, allusions are numerous. One example is found in Matthew 23, in Jesus' apocalyptic discourse about what he calls the end of the age. In verses 34 through 36, Matthew records Jesus saying, "Therefore I send you prophets, sages, and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come upon this generation." Notice how no specific text is quoted or cited, but the allusion to the Old Testament text in a number of places is clear, isn't it? Let's talk next about an echo. An echo is like an allusion, and some New Testament scholars use the two terms as though they were synonyms. For instance, two famous Matthean New Testament scholars, W. D. Davies and Dale C. Allison, see an allusion to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2 in the words that say, "And darkness covered the face of the deep." They see an allusion to those words in Matthew's account of Jesus' crucifixion in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 45, when Matthew writes that darkness came over the whole land. But for other New Testament scholars, and I would include myself among them, we would call this an echo and not an allusion, because an echo is more elusive than an allusion, more of an indirect or implicit connection than an allusion. However, I'm sure you can see that allusions and echoes are sometimes overlapping and sometimes difficult to separate one from the other. Here's another example of an echo. It's found in Matthew chapter 1, in Matthew's genealogy of Joseph and through Joseph of Jesus. In the genealogy, there are four named women: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. And the question is sometimes asked, why women? Why women? But that question doesn't seem to both Matthew, who includes women and their names at other points in his gospel, very important. So a better question to ask is, why these four women? Why not more famous women in the Old Testament? Women like Sarah, for instance, why not include them in the genealogy? Why include these four? Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Matthew obviously intends for those who hear or read the genealogy to see something in the stories of these four women in the Old Testament that's important to the story of Jesus. And although there are other possibilities, the one that seems the clearest connects all four women with non-Jewish backgrounds. Bathsheba was the wife of Uriah, a Hittite. Ruth was a Moabite. Rahab was a Canaanite, and Tamar, in some Jewish traditions, is connected with a Canaanite background too. So by naming these four women who all have backgrounds outside Judaism, Matthew may well intend to echo the way the good news of God came to these women and comes to other people, women and men, through Emmanuel, God with us. And in Matthew, Jesus indeed does preach and teach and demonstrate the good news of the gospel to Gentiles as well as Jews, to Jews and non-Jews. And his final words to his disciples are these: "Go and make disciples of all nations." So the first words of Matthew and the last words indicate Matthew's understanding of the inclusiveness of the gospel as something meant for both Jews and non-Jews, for Jews and Gentiles. And if the context is Matthew at the end of chapter 27 and the beginning of chapter 28, if that context is taken into account in the same way as the context of the genealogy, then the presence of women at Jesus' crucifixion and burial, women who go and discover the empty tomb, women who hear him say in Matthew chapter 28 and verse 10, hear Jesus say, "Don't be afraid, go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." All of this shows that Matthew understands the inclusiveness of the gospel as something meant for women as well as men. Here's a third kind of intertextuality. It's called typology, or the instance of a type in a text. Typology takes place when a person, place, or event from an earlier time or text is named and compared or contrasted in a later time to another person or place or event. Typology is often used in the New Testament to demonstrate a greater sense of meaning or significance to people, places, and events that appear first in the Old Testament, but whom a writer perceives in the light of Christ and the good news of the gospel to be reflected and give an even greater sense of meaning. Let me show you the way in which typology works. In Romans chapter 5 and verse 14, Paul compares Adam to Christ and refers explicitly to Adam as a type of Christ. Paul writes, "Death exercised dominion from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sins were not like the transgression of Adam, who is a type of the one who was to come." The book of Hebrews makes extensive and extended use of typology, comparing Christ to angels, to Moses, and to the lamb sacrificed at Passover. And as you look at Matthew's gospel, one of the most interesting and important ways Matthew makes use of intertextuality has to do with how he portrays events in Jesus' life in ways like the book of Hebrews illustrates, ways that consistently remind you, as you read Matthew, of the life of Moses. Of course, the name Moses isn't used as a Christological title anywhere in Matthew. Jesus is never called the son of Moses because he's the son of David. And yet Jesus is portrayed in Matthew's gospel again and again as being like Moses. And because of that likeness, Jewish readers and Gentiles with knowledge of Judaism, conversant with the Old Testament, are easily reminded of Moses and his words in Deuteronomy 18, in verses 15 through 19. Here's the quotation in the NRSV version. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from among Israel. Him you shall hear. Just as you desired from the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly, when you said to me, 'Don't let us hear the voice of the Lord God again, or see his great fire, or we'll die.' And when he heard it, the Lord said to me, 'All that they have said is right. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among the people of Israel. I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command. And whoever will not give heed to my words, that prophet will speak in my name. I myself will require it of them." Now in Judaism, before and during the time of Jesus, many interpreted Moses to be speaking about the Messiah, the Mashiach, the one that God would anoint to speak his words. And they looked for a Messiah who would fulfill Moses' words. And that makes the parallels between Matthew's text and his portrait of Jesus and the text of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses that begin the Old Testament, and their portrayal of Moses, an instance of extended typology. Here are a few of the parallels. Just as Moses, king of Egypt, killed all the baby boys, and only Moses was saved, In Exodus chapter 1 and 2, you can read the account. So in Matthew 2, Herod, the king of Israel, kills all the baby boys, and only Jesus is saved. Again, just as Moses and Israel move out of Egypt, moves out of Egypt and lives in Midian for 40 years before his ministry to Israel, Jesus moves out of Egypt after Herod's death when his parents return to Nazareth, where Jesus lives for about 30 years before his ministry to Israel. Here's another. Just as God led Moses and the people of Israel into the wilderness, God's Spirit leads Jesus into the wilderness before the beginning of his ministry. Just as Moses goes up a mountain to receive the law, then teaches it to the people of Israel, beginning with 10 commandments, so in Matthew's gospel, Jesus goes up a mount, then teaches the people of Israel in the Sermon on the Mount what he calls the fulfillment of the law of Moses, beginning with 9 Beatitudes. Just as Moses' teaching is collected and presented in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, so Jesus' teaching in Matthew is collected and presented in 5 major discourses, 5 blocks of material of Jesus' extended teaching in Matthew. And there are other typological parallels between the life of Moses as recorded and presented in the Torah, the 5 books of the law, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and the life of Jesus as recorded and presented in the Gospel of Matthew. Dale Allison discusses more of them in a book titled The New Moses, a Matthean Typology. But these examples are representative, and together with other examples, they're enough to convince me and many other New Testament scholars that Matthew both knows about messianic expectations with respect to Moses and his words in Deuteronomy 18, and consciously composes his life of Jesus, Matthew's life of Jesus, the gospel according to Matthew, in such a way as to highlight those parallels. That's typology. There's one more kind of intertextuality that's called a resonance, and I'll talk about that kind of intertextuality with you in my next video, my last video for this week.